The humidity in Miami didn't just hang in the air. It pressed against the reinforced glass of the Level 1 trauma center like a physical weight, thick with the scent of salt air and the metallic tang of an approaching tropical storm. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile, relentless energy, reflecting off the polished linoleum floors that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and hibiscus-scented floor wax. It was 6:58 p.m., the peak of the shift change, the witching hour, where information was as vital as oxygen. Elena Vance, the ER charge nurse, stood at the central station, her eyes scanning the digital board. Her scrubs were crisp, but the condensation from her lukewarm coffee cup made her palms slick, a small but constant sensory reminder of the pressure building both inside and outside the hospital walls. Elena was mid-handoff with the outgoing day shift lead, Sarah. They were reviewing the board, a digital mosaic of triage-level red and yellow cases that seemed to multiply by the minute. The ER was a pressurized chamber of sound, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, the distant muffled siren of an approaching ambulance, and the rapid-fire clicking of keyboards. Sarah was pointing to bed 4, a motorcycle accident with a suspected splenic rupture, explaining the last round of vitals, when the world simply blinked. It wasn't a flicker. It wasn't the cinematic dimming of lights. It was a total, absolute erasure of sight. 1 second, the trauma bay was a hive of controlled clinical activity. The next, it was a tomb. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the darkness. The hum of the HVAC died. The monitors cut to black, and for 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the collective, sharp intake of breath from 50 different people. Then, the emergency red lights kicked in, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls and bathing the ER in a ghostly crimson hue. The air conditioning was gone, and the sudden stillness allowed the heavy, tropical heat to begin its slow, suffocating invasion of the ward. Elena didn't scream. She didn't even drop her coffee. Her internal SOP, standard operating procedure, kicked in before her conscious mind could process the fear. She felt the cool, textured metal of the nurse's station desk under her fingers, using it as an anchor to orient herself in the red-tinted gloom. The backup generators had fired up, but she knew the limitations. The heavy-duty cooling systems remained dead to save power for life support. The scent of ozone from the power surge lingered in the stagnant air, sharp and acrid. "Status report now!" Elena's voice cut through the rising murmur of panicked patients and confused staff. It was a whip-crack of authority that stopped the impending chaos in its tracks. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her heavy-duty penlight and clicking it on. The beam was a steady white blade in the red dark. "Sarah, get the manual BPs. I want a hand on every triage-level red patient in the next 60 seconds. Charge nurses, confirm your vents. If the battery backups don't kick in, I want manual bagging started immediately. We are in a code black. This is not a drill." The blackout wasn't just a loss of light, it was a total loss of data. The EMR, electronic medical records, was dark. The telemetry was gone. They were flying blind in a Level 1 trauma center in the middle of a Miami summer, with 42 patients currently in the bays and a massive multi-car pileup on I-95 reported just minutes before the grid failed. Elena could feel the sweat beginning to bead at her hairline, the salt stinging her skin. The silence of the dead monitors felt like a countdown. The influx of the first trauma patient turned the red-lit ER into a battlefield of shadow and movement. Elena didn't wait for the paramedics to reach the center of the bay. She met them halfway, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum which was already becoming slick with tracked-in rainwater. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline clung to the patient, a young man whose leg had been pinned under a dashboard for 40 minutes before extraction. The heat in the ambulance bay was stifling, a thick, salty humidity that made the air feel like wet wool against Elena's face. "Report!" Elena commanded, her white penlight beam cutting through the crimson gloom to check the patient's pupils. Male, mid-20s, systolic holding at 80 by palpation, tachycardia at 130. The paramedic shouted over the echoing sirens outside. "We lost the line twice in the rig. He's cold, clammy, and trending down fast. We need a central line and a fast track to the OR, but the elevators are manual only right now. We had to carry him up the ramp." Elena felt the patient's skin. It was like touching wet marble. Cold, despite the rising 85-degree air. "Trauma Bay 1, she directed, her voice projecting over the din of a second ambulance backing in. "And someone get me a manual pressure bag for those fluids. We can't rely on the electronic pumps." As they wheeled the stretcher into the bay, the lack of air conditioning became a physical enemy. Without the constant exchange of filtered air, the scent profile of the ER changed rapidly. It was no longer sterile. It smelled of copper-rich blood, human sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of the emergency lead-acid batteries that were struggling to keep the most basic systems alive. Elena watched the patient's chest. The rise and fall were shallow and erratic. Without the digital monitors to beep out a warning or display a waveform, the responsibility of detection fell entirely on her eyes, her ears, and the tips of her fingers. In the corner of the room, a nurse was struggling with a portable suction unit that wasn't holding a charge. The patient started to vomit, a dark, coffee-ground liquid that signaled massive internal bleeding. "Turn him! Now!" Elena barked. They shifted the man just as he aspirated, the sound a wet, rattling choke that filled the small space. Elena grabbed a manual suction bulb, working with a primal focus. Every second the power stayed out, the more the 21st century hospital regressed into a 19th century infirmary. The humiliation of the night began to settle in, not for Elena, but for the technology they had spent millions on. The massive $200,000 imaging machines sat like useless, hulking statues in the dark. The smart medication dispensing cabinets were locked tight, their electronic latches refusing to budge without a server connection, turning life-saving drugs into unreachable artifacts behind plexiglass. "I can't get the morphine or the saline starters," Marcus, a junior nurse, cried out. His voice was bordering on frantic, his pen light dancing erratically across the dead screen of the med station. "The screen is black. The override key isn't turning in the lock." Elena stepped away from the trauma bed for a split second, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders. The fabric of his scrubs was already damp with sweat. "Deep breath, Marcus. Look at me. Use the manual override crowbar in the red emergency kit. If the key won't turn because the solenoid is jammed, you bypass it. We are not letting patients scream because a computer chip is fried. Go. Now." That is an order. She turned back to find the lead surgeon, Dr. Aris, standing in the doorway. He looked at the red-bathed room and the manual blood pressure cuff on the patient's arm, his face a mask of disbelief. "Elena, I can't operate in the dark. The OR backup lights are flickering, and the autoclaves are down. If I open this kid up and the lights go out completely, he's dead on the table. I need a stable environment." "You get what I have, doctor," Elena replied, her voice a steady anchor against his doubt. "We have 3 battery-powered headlamps in the trauma kit and 2 standing halogen portables. The generators are prioritizing the life support circuits. You have power for the vent and the cautery. That's all you get. The rest is your skill. Do you want to lose him here in the hallway?" The pressure was a physical weight on her chest, as heavy as the Miami humidity. She checked the mechanical clock on the wall. 7:18 p.m., 20 minutes since the blackout began. In that time, the temperature in the ER had risen by another 4 degrees. The invisible villain, the heat, was starting to agitate the patients in the waiting room. She could hear the muffled shouting and the rhythmic pounding on the security doors. People were scared, and scared people in a dark, hot room were a recipe for a riot. "Charge! We have another ambulance backing in!" the triage nurse yelled from the bay doors. "I-95 pileup. They're saying it's a code silver situation at the scene, possible hazardous materials involved from a chemical transport truck. We've got patients coming in covered in an unknown oily substance." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. A mass casualty with a hazmat component, in the dark, with no electronic communication and no automated decontamination showers. She looked at her counter. 40 patients already in the ER, 2 incoming traumas, 3 nurses on the floor, and 0 functional computers. The SOP dictated a specific lockdown for hazmat, but the electronic doors were stuck in the open safety position due to the power failure. "Marcus!" Elena called out, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Forget the morphine for a second. Grab the manual door chocks and the yellow floor tape. We need to create a physical hot zone right here in the bay entrance. If those paramedics bring chemicals in here without a manual scrub, this entire ER is compromised. If we lose the air quality, we lose the room. If we lose the room, we lose the night." She moved back to the patient in Bay 1, placing a hand on his forehead. He was shivering now, a sign of worsening shock despite the heat. She had to make a choice. If she pushed him to the OR, she'd lose her lead surgeon for hours. If she kept him here, he'd bleed out in the crimson dark. "Dr. Aris," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that commanded attention. "Take him. Use the headlamps. I'll handle the incoming mess. But if you don't move now, his heart is going to stop before the next ambulance even puts its brakes on. Go." As the surgical team began the grueling manual push of the stretcher toward the service elevators, the first scent of the new arrival reached Elena's nose. It wasn't the copper of blood. It was the sharp, acrid, and suffocating smell of industrial chlorine. The darkness of the hallway seemed to swallow the surgical team, leaving Elena alone in the flickering red glow of the trauma bay. She gripped her pen light, the plastic casing warm from constant use, and watched the ambulance doors swing open. Part A310. The acrid scent of chlorine didn't just drift into the ER. It arrived like an invisible wall, sharp and caustic enough to make Elena's eyes water instantly. This was the moment where the event shifted from a logistical nightmare to a life-threatening disaster. The traces of the past flashed through Elena's mind, memories of a chemical spill she'd managed during a hurricane relief effort years ago. She knew that smell meant the airway was the first thing to go. In the red-tinted gloom, the atmosphere became heavy, the stagnant air trapping the chemical vapors near the floor, where the rising humidity turned them into a toxic mist. "Masks up! N95s for every staff member, now!" Elena's voice was a command that brooked no delay. She didn't wait for them to move. She grabbed a box from the triage desk and began tossing them to the nurses. "If you feel a tickle in your throat or your eyes start to burn, retreat to the north wing and flush with saline. Marcus, get that yellow tape up. We are establishing a hot zone boundary at the ambulance bay threshold. No one crosses without a manual decon wipe down." The counter in her head was ticking. 42 patients in the ward, 32 minutes of battery life left on the portable ventilators, and a rising temperature that was now pushing 89 degrees. The heat was making the chlorine fumes more volatile. Elena saw the second stretcher burst through the doors. The paramedics were wearing fogged-up respirators, their movements frantic in the flickering crimson light. The patient on the gurney was wrapped in a heavy plastic shroud, but the unmistakable hiss of a chemical reaction was coming from underneath it. "Triage level red," the lead medic shouted, his voice muffled and distorted. "This is the driver of the chemical transport. Massive exposure. He's got grade 3 airway burns and his lungs are filling with fluid. We tried to decontaminate at the scene, but the hydrants were dry because the municipal pumps are down. He's still off gassing." Elena felt the weight of the night press down on her, but her resilience remained her primary weapon. She stepped forward, her white penlight beam cutting through the fog of humidity that was now thick enough to see. She reached under the plastic shroud to feel for a pulse. The skin on the man's neck was hot, slick with a combination of sweat and an oily chemical residue that smelled like a burning pool supply store. The pulse was thready and rapid, a filiform beat that signaled his heart was struggling against the lack of oxygen. "I need an emergency intubation kit and a laryngoscope with a fiber optic light that actually works," she ordered, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Marcus, bring the crash cart and the manual suction bulb. If his throat closes completely, we're going to have to do a cricothyrotomy right here on the floor. I'm not losing him to a closed airway." The chaos outside was reaching a fever pitch. Through the reinforced glass of the ER entrance, Elena could see the strobe-like flashes of Miami police cruisers. The palms outside were being whipped into a frenzy by the tropical storm, their fronds slapping against the windows like skeletal hands. The hospital, once a pinnacle of medical technology, felt like a crumbling castle under siege. She heard the distinct, sharp crack of a window breaking in the waiting room upstairs. Panic was beginning to breach the perimeter. "Nurse Vance, the battery on Bed 2's portable vent is failing," a tech screamed from the far corner. The sound was a weak, agonizing chirp, the electronic equivalent of a dying gasp. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't have time for fear. "Marcus, drop what you're doing and take over the manual bag on Bed 2. One squeeze every 6 seconds. Don't stop until I tell you, even if your hands cramp into knots. I'm taking the airway on the hazmat case." She positioned herself at the head of the stretcher. The smell of the chlorine was so intense now that her own throat felt constricted. She ignored the stinging in her eyes, focusing entirely on the task at hand. With her left hand, she performed a jaw thrust maneuver. With her right, she inserted the cold, stainless steel blade of the laryngoscope. The small light on the tip of the blade was the only steady point of brightness in a world of red shadows. "Hold the flashlight right here," she told a terrified resident, pointing to the man's throat. "If I miss the cords, his heart stops in 30 seconds. Focus." The silence in the trauma bay was absolute, save for the rhythmic thump hiss of the manual bags and the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. Elena Vance, whom the younger staff often dismissed as a strict bureaucrat of protocols and SOPs, was now operating with a technical precision that was almost surgical. She saw the vocal cords. They were bright red and swollen, nearly shut. It was a needle-thin window of opportunity. "In," she whispered, sliding the endotracheal tube past the swelling. She immediately connected the manual resuscitator bag. As she squeezed, she felt the resistance of the fluid-filled lungs, but then heard the beautiful, muffled sound of air moving into the chest. "We have an airway, but he's crashing. He needs fluids and he needs them warm." "Elena, the blood warmers are dead!" Marcus yelled from Bed 2, his face drenched in sweat as he pumped the bag. If we give him cold saline, we'll trigger a code blue from hypothermic shock. Use body heat, Elena commanded, her voice an iron anchor. Tuck the saline bags under your armpits. Put them in the AIDS scrubs. Use your hands to friction warm the tubing. Do whatever it takes. We are the machines tonight. We keep them alive until command gets the Block B circuit bypassed. Just then, a heavy metallic thud echoed from the corridor, the sound of a fire axe hitting the pharmacy door. The event was exploding into a new dimension of danger. Elena looked at the mechanical clock. 7:32 p.m. The night had only just begun, and the hospital was fighting for its life on every front. Parte 410. The sound of the pharmacy door being struck was a hollow, ringing iron groan that vibrated through the floorboards, cutting through the rhythmic thump hiss of the manual bags. Elena Vance didn't flinch, even as the Evento Explode stage of the night reached its boiling point. She kept her hands on the chemical driver's resuscitator bag, her eyes locked on the rise and fall of his chest. The smell of chlorine had reached a peak, now mixing with the heavy, humid scent of the tropical rain that was starting to seep through the window seals, creating a damp, earthy musk that felt out of place in a hospital. "Security to the pharmacy corridor now!" Elena barked into her radio, but only static answered. The invisible villain of the blackout had claimed the internal comms too. She looked at Marcus, who was white-knuckled, still bagging the patient in bed too. "Marcus, don't you dare look away from that chest. Focus on the count. 1, 2, 3, squeeze." The red emergency lights flickered, a stuttering, dying pulse that plunged the room into a 3-second void before returning even dimmer than before. In that moment of total darkness, the sensory input was overwhelming. The sound of the wind howling against the reinforced glass, the stinging sensation of the chemical vapors on Elena's neck, and the distant, muffled shouting from the looters or panicked citizens in the hallway. The counter was no longer just about minutes. It was about resources. "Nurse Vance, we're down to our last 2 H cylinders of oxygen in this bay," a tech shouted, his voice cracking. "The central line pressure is dropping. If we don't get more tanks from the basement, these manual bags are just pushing room air." "The basement is flooded and the elevators are death traps," Elena replied, her voice dropping into that low, resonant register of absolute command that had earned her the nickname, the Iron Charge. "We go to the portable tanks. Marcus, the student, anyone who can move, I need you to scavenge every D tank from the transport gurneys in the hallway. Chain them together. We do not lose pressure." The humiliation of the night was palpable. This was one of the most advanced trauma centers in the Southeast, and here they were, scavenging for scrap oxygen like survivors in a wasteland. Elena's hand was beginning to cramp, the repetitive motion of squeezing the silicone bag sending a dull ache up her forearm. She shifted her grip, feeling the heat of the patient's breath through the valve, a warm, moist reminder of the life she was holding onto. If you've ever had to be the calm one in a crisis, comment, "I stayed calm. I want to know you're here." A sudden crash of glass erupted from the triage entrance. A group of people, faces masked by shirts to ward off the chlorine smell, burst into the peripheral vision of the trauma bay. They weren't looking for medicine, they were looking for the backup batteries and the portable lights. The Guerra de Commando was now a physical reality. The administrative staff had retreated to the incident command bunker, leaving Elena as the de facto sovereign of the ER floor. "Stop!" Elena's voice was a whip crack that stopped the lead intruder in his tracks. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the authority of the red light and the steady rhythm of the life support in her hands. "This is a sterile field. There is a hazardous chemical leak in this room. If you come any closer without a respirator, your lungs will begin to blister in 90 seconds. You want to survive the night? Get back behind the fire doors and stay in the north wing." The intruders hesitated. The high-stakes bluff worked. The chlorine was real, but the immediate lethality was an exaggeration. They retreated, the fear of the invisible chemical stronger than their desperation for supplies. Elena didn't breathe a sigh of relief. She didn't have the time. The heat in the bay was now a stagnant 92 degrees. The smell of the hospital was changing. It was losing the scent of bleach and gaining the scent of a storm-tossed city. Elena looked at the mechanical clock. 7:51 p.m. The pileup on I-95 had just sent another wave of ambulances, and she could see their headlights cutting through the rain, reflecting off the rising water in the parking lot. 30 minutes of high-flow oxygen left, the tech whispered, staring at the gauges on the H cylinders. Elena looked at her team. They were exhausted, drenched in sweat, and operating on pure adrenaline. "Then we make those 30 minutes count," she said, her eyes narrowing as the next set of manual bay doors began to groan open. "Prepare for the next wave. Marcus, get the paper charts ready. We're doing this the old-school way." But the door swung open with a violent thud, and the sound of a screaming infant pierced the red gloom, a new level of urgency that threatened to shatter the team's remaining composure. Parte 5-10. The sound of the crying infant was a jagged blade that cut through the heavy, humid silence of the trauma bay. It wasn't just a cry, it was a high-pitched, stridulous wail that signaled a closing airway. Elena Vance didn't let go of the chemical driver's resuscitator bag, but her head snapped toward the door. A young woman, drenched and shivering, was being ushered in by a police officer. In her arms was a 6-month-old baby, its face a terrifying shade of dusky blue. "He was in the back seat of the third car!" the officer shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete. "He inhaled the fumes before we could get the door open. He's losing his drive to breathe." The guerra de commando intensified within Elena's own mind. She had 2 hands and 2 patients requiring constant manual ventilation. Marcus was still pinned to bed too, and the tech was frantically chaining the last oxygen tanks. The counter was no longer just about minutes of oxygen. It was about the number of hands available to sustain life. The temperature in the ER had climbed to a staggering 94 degrees, making every movement feel like wading through thick syrup. "Marcus, stay on your count," Elena commanded as she saw him start to waver. She looked at the police officer. "Officer, I need you. Wash your hands with that sanitizer. Now. You're going to learn how to breathe for a human being in 30 seconds." The officer looked terrified, his eyes darting from the baby to the chemical driver, but he obeyed. Under Elena's sharp, rhythmic instructions, he took over the bag for the driver. Elena moved with a fluid, practiced grace to the infant. The smell of the chlorine was fainter here, but the baby's chest was retracting. A triage-level red emergency. She felt the tiny, rapid pulse against her thumb. The infant's skin felt like hot, damp parchment. If you've ever been the calm one in a crisis, comment "I stayed calm." I want to know you're here. The air in the bay was now so thick with humidity that the red emergency lights seemed to have a physical weight, casting long, distorted shadows that danced as the wind hammered the glass. Elena reached for a pediatric-sized BVM, bag valve mask. She had to be precise. Too much pressure could pop the infant's fragile lungs. Too little would fail to clear the chemical-induced edema. 1, 2, puff. 1, 2, puff. The rhythmic hiss of the tiny bag was a delicate counterpoint to the heavy thumping of the adult bags in the room. "Elena, the pressure in the H cylinder is hitting the red zone," the tech yelled. "We have maybe 10 minutes of high flow left. After that, we're down to the D tanks on the gurneys." The anchor event of the night arrived in the form of a crackling voice over the intercom. "Attention ER staff, the secondary generator is being engaged. Expect a power surge in 60 seconds. A ripple of hope went through the room. Marcus let out a sob of relief, but Elena's eyes narrowed. She knew the SOP for this aging facility. A secondary generator engagement after a total district blackout usually meant a volatile feedback loop. "Nobody plug anything in," she screamed over the baby's wail. "Marcus, tech, disconnect the electronic leads. Now, if that surge hits a grounded monitor, it'll fry every circuit we have left." They scrambled to pull the plugs just as the overhead lights let out a blinding blue-white flash. The sound was like a gunshot, followed by the acrid metallic stench of ozone as the remaining computer terminals in the triage area short-circuited, sending a spray of sparks into the rising water on the floor. Then the silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. The red lights didn't come back on immediately. For 5 agonizing seconds, they were in total, absolute darkness, the only sound being the rhythmic thump, puff, hiss of 3 people manually keeping others alive. "I'm still bagging," Elena said into the dark, her voice a steady, unshakable anchor. "Marcus, report." "Still bagging," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "Officer? I think I'm doing it." "I'm still squeezing," the policeman replied. The red lights flickered back to a dim, dying glow. Elena looked at the baby's face. In the crimson light, she saw the faintest hint of pink returning to the child's lips. It was a victory of seconds, bought with the sweat and muscle of a team that refused to surrender to the machine's failure. But the invisible villain, the heat, was winning. The sweat was stinging Elena's eyes, and her forearms were beginning to cramp with a dull, throbbing fire. "We need a way to cool this room," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the baby. "If the core temperatures keep rising, we're going to lose them to hyperthermia even if we keep their lungs moving. Tech, find the manual crank for the high-level louvers. We need a cross-breeze from the storm, SOP or not." As the tech moved toward the high windows, a new sound began to vibrate through the floor. A low, guttural grinding from the west wing. It wasn't a generator. It was the sound of the floodwaters breaching the basement pump room. Parte 610. The grinding sound from the west wing was followed by a dull, subterranean thud that vibrated through the soles of Elena's shoes. The invisible villain The rising floodwater had finally claimed the basement. In the trauma bay, the air was a stagnant 95 degrees, smelling of wet concrete, ozone, and the sharp, lingering bite of chlorine. Elena's forearms were screaming, a deep, lactic acid burn that made every puff of the pediatric bag feel like she was squeezing lead. "The pumps are gone," Elena stated, her voice flat and factual. "The water in the basement just hit the electrical mains. We aren't getting that secondary generator back. This is it. We are the only power left in this building." Marcus was slumped against the wall, his hands still moving in a rhythmic, mechanical trance on the bag for bed 2. His eyes were glazed, staring at the floor where an inch of murky rainwater was now reflecting the dim, dying red glow of the emergency lights. The silence of the hospital was becoming absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thump-puff-hiss and the relentless drumming of the tropical storm against the glass. If you've ever been underestimated at work, comment, "I know who I am, because I know how that hurts." "Elena," the tech whispered, his hand on the manual window crank. "The SOP says we keep the louvers sealed during a level red hazmat event to prevent vapor spread. If I open these, I'm breaking protocol." "The protocol was written for a building with functional ventilation," Elena replied, her eyes never leaving the baby's chest. "Right now, the heat is a bigger killer than the fumes. Open them. Just enough for a cross breeze. That's an order." As the tech turned the rusted crank, the window groaned and tilted. A gust of wet, 80-degree Miami air swirled into the room. It was humid and salty, but compared to the stifling, toxic heat of the bay, it felt like a reprieve. The smell of the ocean and the storm rushed in, momentarily masking the acrid scent of the chemicals. But with the air came the sound, the roar of the city in chaos, sirens echoing from every direction, and the sound of the I-95 pileup still groaning in the distance. The worst part, was the counter. Elena looked at the H cylinder. The needle was vibrating on the pin of empty. "Tech, the manifold is dying. Switch to the D tanks. We need to prioritize. The infant and the driver get the remaining O2. Marcus, you're going to have to switch bed 2 to room air and use the PEP valve to maintain pressure. We have to stretch what we have." "Elena, I don't know if I can keep this up," Marcus whispered. "My hands, I can't feel my fingers anymore." "Yes, you can," Elena snapped, her voice a cold splash of water. "You're a Miami trauma nurse. You don't have the luxury of quitting. Look at that patient. He's breathing because you're making him breathe. That's the only reality that matters. Count with me. 1, 2, 3, squeeze." The false solution appeared 10 minutes later. A security guard burst through the door, holding a heavy, industrial-sized flashlight. "The fire department is at the perimeter. They've got a portable generator on a sled. They're trying to bridge the gap to the east wing." The team let out a collective breath, a momentary lapse in tension. But Elena stayed focused. She knew the distance from the perimeter to the east wing junction. It was 300 yards of flooded parking lot and debris. "Don't stop," she warned. "A sled in a storm isn't a miracle until the lights turn on. Stay on the bags." Suddenly, the baby in Elena's arms let out a weak, wet cough. His chest didn't rise on the next puff. The resistance in the bag went from soft to rock hard in a second. "He's obstructed!" Elena yelled. "The edema is shifting. I need the pediatric suction now!" The tech scrambled, but as he reached for the portable suction unit, he tripped in the rising water. The unit hit the floor with a sickening plastic crack. In the dim red light, Elena could see the battery casing shatter. The only functional suction in the room was now a pile of useless components. The baby's face began to turn that terrifying dusky blue again. Elena's heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady. She was the SOP in human form, and she was about to do something that wasn't in any manual. "Marcus, hold my bag for 5 seconds, she commanded. She reached for a sterile saline flush and a small manual bulb syringe. The high-stakes reality of the night was about to test her to the breaking point. The baby's chest remained stationary, a terrifyingly still porcelain curve in the flickering red light. Elena Vance dropped to her knees in the inch of murky water on the floor, her focus narrowing until the chaos of the room vanished. The révélation of the night wasn't a secret she told, but a memory that lived in her hands. 10 years ago, in a rural clinic with no power, she had learned that when the machines fail, the body is the only tool left. "I'm going in manually," Elena whispered, more to herself than to the team. She positioned the infant, her fingers feeling the heat radiating from his skin. She used the small bulb syringe not just to suction, but to create a rhythmic, tactile vibration against the infant's chest, a technique used in extreme resource-depleted environments to mobilize deep secretions. "Elena, bed 2 is bradying down," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The heart rate is dropping. I'm pushing room air, but he's not oxygenating. Maintain the PEEP, Marcus. Increase the rate to 12 breaths a minute. Elena didn't look up. She was focused on the tiny airway. With a sharp, practiced flick of her wrist, she cleared a thick, gray plug of chemical-induced mucus from the baby's throat. She immediately repositioned the mask and delivered a breath. The tiny chest rose. Then, a second later, the infant let out a sharp, piercing cry. He's back, the tech breathed, a sob of relief catching in his throat. But the human villain was about to breach the perimeter. The heavy manual doors of the trauma bay erupted open. It wasn't the fire department. It was a group of 3 men, drenched and wild-eyed, led by a man holding a rusted tire iron. Behind them, the Miami storm roared through the open corridor, bringing the smell of salt and wet asphalt into the clinical space. "The generators!" the man screamed, swinging the iron toward the dead monitors. "My wife is on the 3rd floor. Her ventilator stopped and nobody is coming. You're keeping the power for the important ones down here. Give us the batteries." The command war had turned into a siege. The man didn't see a nurse. He saw a gatekeeper to a resource that didn't exist. Elena stood up, still holding the infant to her chest with one arm, while her other hand stayed on the manual bag for the chemical driver. She stood tall in the red shadows, her silhouette reflecting in the water on the floor. "Sir." Elena's voice was a low, resonant frequency of absolute authority. It was the voice of someone who had seen the end of the world and refused to blink. "Look at my hands. I am breathing for a 6-month-old child and a man who was burned by chlorine. There are no batteries. There is no hidden power. We are the only things keeping anyone in this building alive." The man hesitated, the tire iron dipping slightly. The heat in the room was a suffocating 96 degrees now, the sweat stinging everyone's eyes. If you've ever been underestimated at work, comment, "I know who I am, because I know how that hurts." "My wife," the man rasped, his aggression turning into a hollow, desperate grief. "She's all I have." "Then help us," Elena said, her eyes locking onto his. "Marcus is exhausted. If he stops, the patient in bed 2 dies. You want to save a life? Put that iron down, wash your hands in the saline, and take over that bag. If we keep this floor stable, I can send my tech to the 3rd floor with a portable D tank for your wife. But if you break anything in this room, everyone dies, including her." It was a high-stakes gamble. She was giving a panicked, untrained civilian control over a life support device. But she knew Marcus was seconds away from physical collapse. The man looked at Marcus, then at Elena, then at the dying red light. He dropped the tire iron. It hit the flooded floor with a heavy splash. "Tell me what to do," the man whispered. Elena didn't waste a second. As the tech grabbed the last portable oxygen tank and disappeared into the dark stairwell toward the 3rd floor, Elena coached the intruder on the rhythm. Squeeze 2, 3, 4, squeeze 2, 3, 4. The counter was now lethal. 5 minutes of oxygen left in the current tanks, 1 untrained civilian on a bag, and a tech gone into a dark building. Elena looked at her watch. 8:22 p.m. The night was a black ocean, and they were a tiny, red-lit raft. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to vibrate again. This time it wasn't the flood. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping from the ceiling above. The thumping from above was a mechanical, rhythmic growl that shook the dust from the acoustic ceiling tiles, sending a fine white powder drifting down into the murky water on the floor. Elena Vance didn't look up. She couldn't. Her hands were locked in the delicate puff cycle for the infant, her eyes tracking the rise of the tiny ribs in the flickering crimson light. The war plan was no longer a theory. It was a desperate, physical struggle against the environment itself. "The roof," Marcus gasped, his voice barely a shadow of its former self. He was slumped in the corner, his hands trembling as he watched the intruder, the man who had threatened them moments ago, now rhythmically squeezing the bag for bed 2. "Elena, that's the ventilation fans trying to kick over. The fire department must have tapped into the external bus." The false solution of hope was dangerous, but Elena didn't let it distract her. "Marcus, if those fans kick on without the scrubbers, they'll just pull more chlorine vapor from the ambulance bay into the internal corridors. We need to seal the vents. Now." The temperature in the trauma bay had reached a stagnant, suffocating 98 degrees. The smell of the room was a nauseating cocktail of salt, vomit, and the metallic ozone of failing equipment. Elena could feel the sweat dripping down her back, her scrubs plastered to her skin like a second, suffocating layer. Every breath felt like inhaling warm, wet wool. "Tech's not back!" Marcus yelled, looking at the dark stairwell door. "He's been gone too long. If the 3rd floor is flooded, he's trapped." "He'll make it," Elena said. though her heart hammered a different rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the intruder. "Sir, you're doing great. Keep that rhythm. 1, 2, 3, squeeze. Don't stop. If you feel resistance, tell me." The counter hit a new level of crisis. The last H cylinder on the manifold let out a long, dying hiss. The pressure gauge needle dropped below the empty pin. They were now officially out of high-flow oxygen. "Switching to room air," Elena commanded. "Marcus, get the PEEP valves. We have to maintain the pressure in their lungs even if we can't give them 100% oxygen. It's the only way to keep the fluid from drowning them." The war plan shifted. Elena moved the infant to a makeshift carrier she fashioned from a sterile wrap, strapping the child to her chest so her hands were free to work. She grabbed a heavy manual wrench from the emergency kit. The high-stakes reality was that the building was becoming a tomb of stagnant air. "We need the rooftop cache," Elena said, her voice dropping into that chilling, focused register. "SOP 404, there's a manual manifold in the emergency storage on the helipad. It's gravity-fed. If I can get it down here, we can bypass the entire electrical system." "Elena, you can't go to the roof," Marcus cried. "The stairs are blocked by the security lockdown and the service elevator is a cage. You'll be stuck." "Then I go outside," Elena replied. She looked at the manual crank window she had ordered opened earlier. Outside, the Miami storm was a screaming wall of black water and wind. "The maintenance hoist is right outside that window. It's manual. I can use the gear crank to get to the 10th floor." The plan was a suicide mission by any standard clinical protocol, but tonight the protocols were dead. Elena climbed onto the counter, the rainwater splashing as she moved. The wind roared into the room, bringing the smell of salt and the sound of the city's agony. She looked at Marcus and the intruder, one a broken nurse, the other a desperate father. "Don't stop counting," she said, her eyes burning with a fire that the darkness couldn't touch. "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, you start the manual rotations. You breathe for them until your hearts stop." She stepped out into the howling storm, the heat of the ER instantly replaced by the stinging cold needles of the rain. The maintenance hoist was a rusted steel platform, swaying violently in the gale. Elena grabbed the manual winch, the cold iron biting into her palms. As she began to crank, the gears groaning against the wind, Elena looked back through the window at the tiny, red-lit square of the trauma bay. It looked like a single flickering candle in a vast black sea. She was 100 feet in the air, suspended by a wire, while her counter screamed, 12 minutes of lung life left, 10 floors to go, 1 night to survive. The first true light of dawn was not a golden sunrise, but a bruised violet filtration through the humid haze that clung to the shattered skyline of Miami. Inside the east wing of the Level 1 Trauma Center, the sudden, sharp stabilization of the overhead lights felt violent after so many hours of crimson gloom. The sterile white glare revealed the true wreckage of the night, a floor slick with a murky cocktail of rainwater and antiseptic, walls scarred by the soot of short-circuited monitors, and a team that looked like survivors of a shipwreck. Elena Vance stood perfectly still by the central station, her boots still submerged in an inch of receding water. The hum of the high-flow ventilation systems had returned to its steady, mechanical purr, a sound that, only hours ago, had seemed like a distant luxury from a lost civilization. The catharsis was silent. There were no cheers, no high-fives, and no celebratory shouts. The air conditioning kicked in with a dry, frigid gasp, and the immediate drop in temperature caused a fine mist to rise from the damp floors. Elena felt the infant shift against her chest. She carefully unstrapped the makeshift carrier, her muscles spasming with a deep systemic fatigue that made her hands shake. She looked down at the child. His skin was no longer a terrifying dusky blue, but a healthy, vibrant pink. He was sleeping, his tiny lungs moving in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic chirping of the now active pediatric monitor. Across the room, the intruder, the man who had stormed the bay with a tire iron, was still sitting by bed 2. His hands were frozen in the shape of the manual resuscitator bag he had been squeezing for hours. He stared at the mechanical ventilator that had taken his place, his eyes wide and glazed with a mixture of shock and profound relief. Marcus was slumped on the floor beside him, his head resting against the cold tiles. His eyes closed as he breathed in the first, filtered, cool air of the morning. They were no longer a nurse and a threat. They were 2 humans who had shared the same desperate rhythm to keep a stranger's heart beating. The epilogue began at 6:45 a.m. when the double doors of the ambulance bay hissed open with their normal pneumatic efficiency. The day shift staff walked in, their scrubs crisp and smelling of laundry detergent and fresh coffee. They stopped dead in their tracks, paralyzed by the sight. They saw the yellow tape, the manual oxygen manifolds Elena had dragged down from the roof, and the soot-stained faces of the night crew. They looked at Elena, who stood covered in grease from the maintenance hoist, sweat, and the dried salt of the storm. "Report," Elena said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it had been dragged over stones. She didn't tell them about the fear. She didn't tell them about the moment she thought the building would swallow them whole. She gave a clinical, professional handoff. She spoke of triage-level red interventions, airway management under hazardous conditions, and the successful stabilization of 42 patients without a single loss of life. She was the SOP until the very end. The incoming nurses took the clipboards with trembling hands, realizing that the high-stakes stories they had heard about Elena Vance weren't exaggerations. They were understatements. The villain's fall was finally complete. The storm had moved inland, leaving behind a city that was dark but beginning to stir. Elena walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the now bright hallway. She passed the administrative officers who were just emerging from their fortified bunkers, already talking about liability and equipment damage costs. She didn't look at them. Their world was one of paper and spreadsheets. Hers was one of blood, bone, and the 30 seconds of oxygen left in a dying tank. As she stepped out into the Miami morning, the heat was already rising, but it was a different heat, the heat of a new day. She looked at her hands, the grease from the hoist etched into the lines of her palms like a map of the night's journey. She had been the power when the grid failed. She had been the lungs when the machines died. She climbed into her car, the silence of the morning a beautiful, heavy weight. If this story reminded you that the best technology in a hospital is the person holding your hand, hit that like button and subscribe for more high-stakes ER drama. Comment, "I am the power," if you've ever had to be the strength for someone else when the world went dark. Elena turned the key, the engine's hum a minor echo of the ventilators she had left behind, and drove toward the light of a city that had no idea it had been saved by the person who stayed calm in the dark.